I'm Bill McKillop, a professor emeritus of Forestry Economics at the University of California, Berkeley, the College of Natural Resources. Well, I grew up in the northeast of Scotland, and in the mountains we had lots of trees, but in the lowlands of Aberdeenshire, I'm a native of Aberdeen, Scotland, there were not many trees. So anytime I saw a tree, I wanted to know what the species was and the Latin name. And I think I bought, and my first purchase of a book was a book on tree identification. And I had an affinity for trees all my life. And then when I decided to go to university, my high school library had a pamphlet on forestry as a career. I read that and I applied for admission to the University of Aberdeen, which is my hometown university, to study forestry. So I got accepted. And even before that, I was very active in outdoors, climbing mountains, backpacking, and had a great love of trees. And forestry was a field in which I had a great personal interest. Oh, I would only have been 12 or 13 or so. It was a fairly simple book. It had pictures of trees and the Latin name as well as the common name. So it was a handy small size. I could take it with me when I went out in the countryside on my bike. Well, I was very active in mountain climbing and backpacking and sports too. I played rugby and tennis, things like that. I read a lot. I think by the time I was 18, I had read all the classics. And then when I went to the University of California, they have a great library there. I'd taken a great interest in military matters. So I had, they had a huge collection in World War II, probably 100 books. And so as an undergrad, the TV was not available, which was no great loss at that time. I care a lot for TV now, but back then it was nothing very much. So I would spend a lot of time reading. When I got my bachelor's degree in forestry, it was a 3-year degree. I had intended to go to the East Africa, say to Kenya, to enlist in the Colonial Forest Service. But at that time, the Mau Mau terrorists were cutting heads off settlers and government officials. So I looked around as an alternative and applied for a fellowship to go to Canada. There's a guy called Max Aiken who founded the Daily Express, incidentally, which newspaper I was reading before you came. His name was Max Aiken, and he moved to Britain, founded the Daily Express, was an advisor to all kinds of important people like Edward VII, the one who, I guess, married Mrs. Simpson, and Beaverbrook was his close confidant. But he wanted to encourage British foresters to go to New Brunswick, which was his native state and native province in Canada. So he would give fellowships to a few British foresters every year. And so I went to the University of New Brunswick and did a master's degree, it was okay. My master's thesis was a study of the management behavior of small forest landowners in the province of New Brunswick. Once I got my degree there, or even before I got it, I applied for a job with the Canadian Department of Forestry, first in forest inventory research, and then in forest economics. And then after a while, I decided I needed a PhD. So I looked around, and my wife at that time was fascinated by the idea of going to California. So I applied to the University of California and was accepted there. And so I started, that must have been about 1961. Yeah, we came to California in 61, and I went into the Forest Economics program there, which was handled by the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics. While I was a grad student, the professor that taught a course called Forest Mensuration, we call it biometrics now, sadly he died. But even though I was a grad student in forest economics, I had my experience in Canada, and I was taking a degree in statistics too. So I was well qualified for that job, so they got me to teach this course, and eventually, when certain people retired, I ended up teaching forest economics, and which was a program teaching, but research and research and teaching. So that's the story of my interest in forestry. Well, I don't know about challenges because I think I've always been lucky to have pretty clear perspectives on things. So there were no real difficulties I had to overcome. And then because of my work as an assistant professor, then a full professor at UC Berkeley, I got invitations to go on various foreign trips as a visiting prof in China and Beijing, Chile in South America, Turkey. That was a trip I really enjoyed, the trip to Turkey. At that time, which I guess would have been the mid-70s, we were having difficulty in diplomatic relations with Turkey. So the State Department asked about 4 or 5 of us professional foresters to go on a trip to Turkey. State Department paid our expenses, and then to get there, then once we got there, the Turkish Forest Service and the University of Istanbul hosted us, took us all over Turkey, mixing forestry, field forestry, with historic areas like the Blue Mosque and the Ankara and Çanakkale. That was an interesting trip. So that was a very interesting trip for me. But I also enjoyed the trips to Chile and to Beijing. The Beijing forestry people were very good. They gave us a car and a driver and an interpreter, and I would lecture for 3 hours in the morning. They're quite demanding. 3 hours of lecturing continuously is not easy, but after lunch they take us to various sites like the Great Wall and the Summer Palace, and my wife at that time was with me. She's deceased now, so I had a very interesting time in China too. Let's see. A thing that I really found very rewarding is I seem to be in some demand as an expert witness on court cases and testifying before legislatures like Congress or the state of California. That was always a challenge. I enjoyed that. I even enjoyed being cross-examined by opposing attorneys. But I did enjoy that a lot. Then, we had to publish. Cal is quite demanding, and people publishing letters, publishing articles. And so that was fairly hard work to keep up a flow of publications, but I managed to do that. And, that as a professional career was wonderful, because even though my research was office located in econometrics, once or twice a week, or once a week at least, I would call up a forester and say, look, I'd like to get out in the woods, and that forester would take me out on their property and show me what they were doing out there and visiting sawmills, things like that. So I found that very rewarding too. Oh, that's interesting. The University of Aberdeen, like most British universities, had a heavy emphasis in their forestry program on the biological aspects of forestry. That was okay, but there was a lot of facts and not too many concepts involved. So I did enjoy the concepts of ecological succession. I enjoyed that. But then I was forever, when they tell me about some recommended silvicultural practices that they might engage in, being a working class Scots boy, I would immediately want to know what the cost of that activity would be. And so gradually I became the department little expert on cost issues in quality economics. So that got me interested in the economics of it. And then so when I went to the University of California, I was all ready to grab any ideas in economics that would be applicable to forestry. So I thoroughly enjoyed that experience. Well, I'm not big on hero worship, but my career gravitated within forestry economics, gravitated to quantitative analysis, particularly econometrics and statistics. And we had a professor there in the Department of Statistics and also the Agricultural Resource Economics called George Kuznets. He was a fantastic teacher of statistics. So he and another prof, Jim Bowles, persuaded me to do a master's in statistics along with my PhD. So those two guys helped me along quite a bit. Then in forestry, we had a kind of an interesting faculty. it was quite diverse. There were a few people in forest economics in that department. But there was also, it was a multidisciplinary department. We had wildlife experts, soil science experts, silviculturists, geneticists, and it was a very interesting, I enjoyed the interplay of the different subject matters that was available in the School of Forestry, as it was called then. All right, so I intended to go back to Canada. Incidentally, I was a member when I worked in Canada of the Canadian Institute of Forestry. And in Scotland, I think I was a student member of the Royal Scottish Forestry Society. So I thought, hey, here we are in America. Why don't I belong to the Society of American Foresters? So when my wife persuaded me that we should stay in California, she came on a visa, a British visa, and had her immigration credentials all lined up, and so I decided. At that time, it was easy to get a visa if you were from Britain. So I decided that would be a good thing to do, to take out my citizenship. So when we decided that on, I think, 1964, I decided to join the Society of American Foresters since I was going to stay here, and I really wanted to be part of that society. And then I took out, eventually got my citizenship in 1968. So I think I've been a member of the Society of American Foresters maybe since 1964, and that has been wonderful because it gave me an entree into various field experiences with SAF meetings and seminars, things like that. And I've always read the Journal of Forestry, Forest Science, as well as my many readings in economics. Well, I was pretty diverse I did quite a bit of consulting and advisory work and testifying, things like that. I tended to be more interested in the timber aspects of forestry rather than environmental issues like wildlife and things like that. But because I was an active backpacker, I was out in the woods a great deal, in addition to the visits I had with timber company people. So my emphasis was definitely timber oriented, but I could handle all the other things too. Well, when I first came to California, the Forest Service was active and was, highly respected. But come around, I guess the 60s, Nixon, I think, signed the Endangered Species Act and the NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, which put huge restrictions on the Forest Service and on private landowners too, forest landowners too. And so the environmentalists were very politically smart and made life hell for landowners and the U.S. government agencies like the U.S. Forest Service and, say, the Bureau of Land Management in their forest holdings. So the issue is to be able to deal with challenges that people raise up, to try to control what is done in forest lands. I think the SEF is now beginning to do a fairly good job of pleading the case for forestry before legislative bodies, and say in California, the State Board of Forestry. So it's a matter of educating the public that it's not really bad to cut a tree, that trees are a renewable resource if you treat them right, retain the soil in good condition, take care of wildlife and associated environmental issues. So it's a matter of educating the public. So that would be the biggest thing. But foresters are, I'd say, notoriously easygoing people. So you need a few feisty people to take up the gauntlet. Well, be scientific. Line up all your facts and theories, and be well prepared when you go to meet with diverse groups of people. So be prepared. Well, all foresters love trees, and they love the sustainable forests. And actually, foresters do an excellent job of the sustainable management of forests. But the problem is that many groups want different things from forestry, and say from the national forest or from private lands. And so there's an ongoing conflict of people wanting to control the management of forest lands. I think the Forest Service principles are excellent, and I think that the Society of American Foresters principles are excellent, and it's a matter of them continuing to promote those principles in legislation, with the media, public hearings, and so on. Well, we went through a very tumultuous period with environmental groups wanting to control the forests. But I think we've got that handled. The Forest Practice Act in California has settled down and is a good background for a good basis for managing private lands. We think we've managed to deal with the demands of environmentalists in a rational way, and so I think we've made good progress there. And on the national forests, the poor Forest Service is still handicapped by numerous assaults on their ability to manage the forests, but little by little, the public and the courts are beginning to realize that the U.S. Forest Service is doing a good job given the restrictions imposed upon it by Congress and NEPA regulation and the various acts that Endangered Species Act that control federal activity. So I think things are going to be good. They're stable now, and I think they'll stay stable. Well, a lot of people pick an issue to get attention and to raise money. So I don't think that there are any issues that are not being dealt with in a reasonable manner. You have to consider what some of the claims of climate change are. For example, to what degree does carbon dioxide in the atmosphere raise global temperatures? And so you have to ask if CO2 affects climate, then let's ask what humans can do about it. And some of the proposals that are put forward for dealing with CO2 are so outrageously expensive that we cannot do it. So some proposals are rational, and they are a good balance between the economics and the environmental issues. And so if we adopt those and don't go hog wild on crazy schemes, then we'll do okay. Well, I've worked in forests and I've seen forests all over the world. If the soil is protected, then you've got trees will grow in spite of people. So I like forests that are a range of different age classes of trees. I've spent time in strictly old-growth forests, and they are very nice. But I like the variety that you get from a range of different age classes. So I like to see young forests growing. They're called early cereal stages. I like the mature, old-growth forests too, but I like the variety. So if you give me the variety and you preserve the productivity of the soil, then that would encompass my views of what are necessary for a healthy forest. Well, they're not going to make much money as a forester. That's for sure. And my advice would be is get your basic forestry and then specialize in a field. Like in my own case, it was economics. You interviewed Bill Libby. His specialty was genetics. Other people do soil science. So it's a good idea to get your basic forestry degree and then develop a specialty. That's a great way to go. Well, there was an abundance of timber, standing timber available for harvesting when I first came to California. But then environmental issues clamped down on the U.S. Forest Service. I think a lot of these demands from environmentalists were unreasonable and done for political purposes. And so at that time, the Forest Service was producing a large amount of timber and reforesting the land. It was definitely sustainable forestry. And so there was plenty timber on the national forest, and there still is, but there are restrictions on whether you can cut it or not. So there was abundant supply, but environmental issues, Endangered Species Act, intricacies of the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, things like that, have restricted the amount of timber that can be produced on the national forest. As a result, many sawmills and wood processing plants in California have had to close. So that's created bottlenecks, the closing of processing plants, because we now see in California, especially Southern California, we really should thin out the forest to reduce the fire danger, but it's hard to get someone to buy the timber and cover the costs of doing it. We can't spend our taxpayers' money very efficiently. But if we could restore some of the processing facilities, loggers would do a great job of thinning out the forest and reducing the fire hazards. And as for demand, demand for California lumber would be high if it was available. But at the moment, we're getting timber from Canada, because a lot of the forests are being destroyed by insects and disease or fire, it would be nice to be able to salvage all this dead wood. So that would help the supply quite a bit. But, there always be ways of modifying the type of product that's produced to meet the public demand. Well, I'm a free market economist. I think that REITs and the trusts are a response to the value of wood, and in a sense, some environmental restrictions have made their activities more attractive as an investment, because trees grow in spite of the fact that some people don't think so. Trees are renewable. They are a good investment if you can afford to pay the taxes on the land and things like that. So it really is those if they're willing to put their money into buying forest lands, fine. It's not necessarily good to have conservation per se, as long as they can harvest the timber to pay off their loans for investing in these REITs, things like that. Trees grow, it accumulates biomass. But sooner or later, the trusts will want to get a return on their investment, and I just hope that society will accept that they can do that. I maybe would prefer to see the land intensively used for growing wood, but if they want to set aside portions of it, that's their business. People seem to be elected fellows if, say, they were the chairman of a department of forestry, kind of an automatic thing. Now, I was acting department head for a year or two to let Dennis Teagarden, the chair, get off on sabbatical. I did that, but I didn't meet that exact requirement of being a department chair. So I think some of my former students appreciated the testimony I'd given, the reports I'd done, urging better management of lands. So they, on their own volition, got together and they proposed it. So thank you, folks.